Hi and welcome to today's Conceived Baby discussion, or tonight as it's here in Melbourne. I'm your host, Tasha Jennings, and today we're going to be talking about a topic which historically really hasn't received that much attention. Infertility has, for a long time, largely focused on the female, particularly in the preconception period. So we're going to be turning the tide tonight and looking at the role of male preconception health. And I'm thrilled to be speaking with a fabulous expert in this field whose latest research was just published in The Lancet earlier this month. And that's Assistant Professor of Reproductive Biology, Dr. Adam Watkins. Dr. Watkins' research is exploring the role that a father's diet may have on influencing the quality of his sperm in regards to fertility outcomes, as well as the long-term health outcomes for the child. His research shows that a father can influence not only the early development of the embryo, but can also affect the environment within the uterus in which an embryo will develop. Now, this research is really providing new insights into the importance of a father's lifestyle at the time of conception for fertility, but also for the long-term health implications for the child. So I'm thrilled to be having him joining us live from the UK. Welcome, Adam.
Good evening. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us today at relatively short notice. I know we're speaking off air and your research just came through my feed, and I was really compelled to reach out to you because I found your insights into the role of sperm on, fertility and pregnancy outcomes really insightful. We've previously thought that the male's role is just to get to the egg and to fertilize the egg, and then the female takes over from there. But your research is really showing otherwise. So, first of all, tell us a bit about your background and what inspired you to start researching this field.
A lot of my research has been focused on how events during very early development, the first few days of conception and pregnancy, how they're very sensitive to their environment and how they can influence the development and ultimately the long-term health of the offspring that come from those embryos. So I'd always had an interest in reproductive biology and physiology, and I was incredibly lucky that I managed to get a PhD with Professor Tom Fleming in Southampton. And there we started to look at how the embryo in an in vitro environment, in a culture environment, and this was in mice, can influence the development of the embryo and how those embryos, as they develop, their cardiovascular and metabolic health seems to be affected. From there, I moved into looking at maternal diet, again, during very early development, the first few days of conception, and again, this was done in mice. And it was during this time that an idea came to me that was, while we are looking at the health of the mother and the diet of the mother, and this seems to be very, very important, we seem to have overlooked the role of the father, and we don't seem to be looking at how does a father's health influence this, because if the mother's having a very good diet and a good lifestyle during pregnancy or even before pregnancy, can this be completely undone if the father is having a very poor diet? So over the last few years, I've simply taken our model that we used in the maternal diet and flipped it onto the male. So again, using a mouse model, because we can do these kinds of studies much more easily in a mouse, and looked at what is the impact of having a poor diet for a father, how does that influence his sperm, and how does that then influence the long-term health of his offspring. So that's where we are at the moment.
Yeah, and look, talk a little bit about the role of sperm. I think, as I said, we previously thought it's all about the woman. Once the sperm gets there, fertilizes the egg, the woman takes over. And so it's all about her health and her uterine environment, and she really nurtures that developing embryo. But your research shows that the sperm and, in fact, the seminal plasma affects the embryo as much possibly as the female.
Indeed, and as you rightly say, so the focus has always been on the mother having a good health either prior to pregnancy, which is best. We know that certainly in women, it's a good idea to look at your lifestyle, your diet, maybe your weight for several months leading up to becoming pregnant. And we know that obviously, and it stands to reason, that her diet and her lifestyle during pregnancy can influence the way that her child develops. And we've always just assumed that all the father's contributing is his genes, as you say, the sperm, carries his genes to the egg, fertilizes it, and that is essentially the role of the father done. But we're beginning to understand over the last decade, really, that actually the sperm is not just a vehicle for the father's genes. It's a very, very complex cell. It's carrying lots of information that can be influenced by the environment, by the health of the father. We know that if a father is overweight or diabetic or smokes too much or drinks too much, we know that these can influence many aspects about the sperm. It can influence the integrity of the DNA, whether the DNA is intact or whether it's fragmented into lots of little bits. And there's also lots of other bits of genetic information, and the way that the sperm DNA is packaged can be influenced by the health of the father. And this can pass on, and this can change aspects of the very early embryo during those first few hours even of conception, and can change patterns of gene expression within the early embryo. We also know, as you were just alluding to, that actually the fluid, the seminal plasma, the fluid that the sperm are carried in, interacts with maternal and uterine environment during those first few days of conception. And I would highly advise anyone who's listening or watching this webcast to go and also have a look at the webcast from Sarah Robertson, because she's really a world expert on this kind of thing, and she goes into it in much more detail. But the seminal plasma carries information and antigens from the father which interact with the uterine environment, and it seems to influence many aspects of this uterine environment into which the embryo will ultimately travel and develop. And it can influence signaling molecules, it can influence metabolites which feed the embryo. And we seem to think from our research that if the diet of the father is not good, it's suboptimal, it's poor quality, that this changes this environment of the uterine environment, and that can change the way that the early embryo develops. And again, we know from our maternal studies that if we change the maternal diet during early pregnancy, again, that environment within the uterus changes. The amount of metabolites, the amount of signaling molecules there can influence the way the embryo develops. So it seems that also the father can influence this environment, not just the information that's being passed, the genetic information being passed in the sperm, but also the environment that embryo is going to develop in. And we know that this is a very crucial time in both human development as well as in our animal models, for really kind of establishing many of the important mechanisms and pathways in the early embryo that will tell it how to develop, things like how the placenta will develop and how big the fetus should grow. And these can ultimately influence the long-term health of the offspring.
Wow, so it's definitely not the DNA carrier that we've kind of assumed that it was, carrying the genetics, and when once it's done there, it's done its job. It's obviously providing a lot more details about, as you said, the embryo's development, how big it's going to grow, well beyond just, supporting the DNA, creating that DNA. And you mentioned Sarah Robinson. We've got, if you want to check out her podcast at tashajennings.com.au, we did a webinar and podcast with Professor Sarah Robinson, and I know her research has really, inspired you to be researching this field as well. So you can jump on there and check that one out as well. So, I mean, when we're talking about the sperm health and the implications of that, we're talking about the growth of the embryo. Beyond, it's obviously for fertility. We know sperm health affects fertility health, but it's also the embryo development and the long-term health implications of the child that your research is showing. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so we've done a series of studies, again, going back to the mouse work, where we fed mice a low protein diet. So this is a diet which has half the amount of protein that the control diet has. And this is not necessarily a very harsh diet. We're not making the males underweight. We're not really changing their physiology too much. So their levels of testosterone are the same, the amount of sperm that they produce are the same. But what we find is when we look at the offspring from these males, that they are born significantly heavier. And again, we know from a lot of the animal data and a lot of the human data that we look at, that if you're born significantly large or significantly small, so being born of a different weight, this can predispose you when you become older to being more overweight yourself, so having elements of obesity, type 2 diabetes, where you can't regulate your blood sugar too well, and having changes in your blood pressure regulation and the way your blood vessels work. So obesity, type 2 diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. So we're seeing that just having a poor father's diet can, at the time of conception or in the weeks leading up to conception, can significantly influence the long-term cardiovascular and metabolic health of their offspring. And these, just like to point out that these offspring, we haven't done anything to these offspring, we haven't manipulated their diet, and the maternal diet is not altered during pregnancy as well. All we're altering is the diet of the father. So we know that it is a paternally transmitted effect. This information, this programming of the offspring's long-term cardiovascular metabolic health is coming in relation to the diet that we gave to the fathers. And we're now beginning to tease apart, if you like, we know what we're doing to the dad's diet and we know how we're influencing the offspring health. The real goal now is to match up and fill in those gaps in between and work out how. How do we go from a poor father's diet to the poor cardiovascular health of the offspring? And so we're beginning to kind of work out things like we're going to be hopefully doing some research looking at, does the function of the placenta change? And we know there are lots of genes that are carried by the father and the mother that regulate how well and how efficiently the placenta works. And there's a theory that the father's genes, he wants big, healthy, robust offspring to pass on his genes over the next generation. We're thinking evolutionary-wise here. And whilst the mother still wants her offspring to develop, she doesn't want it to happen at the consequence of her own health during pregnancy. So her genes kind of constrain fetal growth, and the father's genes really promote fetal growth through the placenta. And when we look at the placenta from our males fed the low protein diet, we see that the regulation, the balance of these genes seems to be altered, suggesting that a father may be trying to get the upper hand and trying to change maternal physiology during pregnancy to feed and generate his bigger, stronger offspring. But ultimately that has consequences for the long-term health of those offspring because they become predisposed to obesity, cardiovascular disease, and type 2 diabetes. So it's a trade-off that doesn't necessarily always work.
So the sperm can really obviously influence the egg quality and what it becomes the embryo. We've known, I guess, that the egg can alter DNA in the sperm to some extent, but obviously, it works in tandem. So it's a bit of a battle there, really. It's not the easy fertilization that we're led to believe.
It's not. And if we think kind of evolutionary wise, it's a battle, as you say. It's a trying to make sure that your genes are passed on. And if that means that we change the information that is carried within our sperm, and ultimately our sperm and the eggs are directly influenced by the diet and the environment of the parents. So that passes information down to the sperm, down to the eggs, and that tells the embryo how to develop. And ultimately, we think it's information that tells the developing fetus and the offspring what the environment is going to be like once it's born. And if that information is correct, if that offspring is born into an appropriate environment that's correct for the information passed on by the parents, then that's great because you've adapted your physiology, you've adapted the way you've developed to be appropriate for that life, for that environment. If, however, you're born into a very different environment, then that's when things kind of go wrong. The way you adapted in the uterus based on your parents' diet, if that's incorrect for what you then start to have as your diet and your environmental conditions once you're born, then those adaptations are not appropriate. And we think that is one of those things that then really programs whether you're likely to become overweight, diabetic, or have obesity. So it's really important that the information that is carried in the sperm in relation to a father's lifestyle, smoking, drinking, being overweight, very important because once that information is passed on to the egg, then that pathway, those developmental programming mechanisms are set in place, and that really kind of then sets that trajectory to potential ill health for the offspring.
So I know your research has focused on metabolic health and cardiovascular health, particularly for the males, and how the sperm influences those. What sort of predispositions does that lead to in the embryos or in the growing child?
So we see from our model, we see that the embryo actually, a few days before the embryo is going to implant, which in the mouse is about 3 days after conception, we looked at the metabolism and genes that regulate a lot of central metabolic pathways within the early embryo. And we saw that these genes were significantly downregulated. And we think this is partly occurring because the information from the father is passed on to the embryo and telling the embryo how to set its own metabolic levels. But we also think, going back again, that this seminal fluid is influencing the uterine environment that the embryo is in. And of course, during this time, these first few days, the embryo is getting all of its nutrition from that maternal uterine environment. And that also helps to establish various, what we call set points, if you like, within the embryo. It tells it how it's going to regulate its metabolism going forward in response to these cues that it gets from the uterine environment. And if those cues tell it to behave and set its metabolism in one trajectory, then that can set it off down the long-term health, long-term pathway to ill health. So we can start to see changes in the very, very early embryo within the first few days of conception. We also see that these fetuses, as they grow into just before they're about to be born in the mouse, that these fetuses are significantly larger. And we know that having increased fetal growth is another factor that can predispose you to having long-term cardiovascular and metabolic ill health. And that's true for humans as well as in the animal models. And as I was saying before, we see changes in the way that the placenta seems to be organized and the way that the placenta seems to be transporting nutrients to the fetus. If you like, we think that the placenta has been hijacked by the father. He's changed the way that the placenta works so that it's potentially stripping out nutrients from the mother to feed his offspring. So we see that those offspring are bigger, their skeletons are bigger, but then when they grow up, they have this poor cardiovascular metabolic health. So right from the sperm, through the early embryo, through fetal development, and through adult life, we can detect changes, significant changes in the way that these offspring are developing in response to this suboptimal diet that we've given to our male mice.
And I think that's a key that you've said there is suboptimal. So we're not talking about, a really deficient diet here. Can you talk about the diet that you did provide these mouse models? It was, low protein was really the main factor that you looked at here.
It was. So the thing that we did, and this is a diet that has been widely used in the maternal studies, and again, this was a diet I used earlier when I was doing my maternal studies. It's been widely used to look at the impact of poor quality diet. So we halve the amount of protein, and we're not starving the animals, the males or the females by any means. It's just a suboptimal amount of protein. But we also increase the amount of carbohydrate. And this is one of the difficulties with a lot of these kind of nutritional studies. If you alter many aspects of the diet, it then becomes hard to work out what component of the diet is actually causing these changes. So our diet had a little bit less protein and a little bit more carbohydrate, but they were ultimately balanced for calories. And we see in our males that the sperm, the information, and this is information that we've not mutated the DNA that's within the sperm, but we're altering the levels of tags that are on the DNA that regulate whether genes are expressed or not. And this is a level of regulation of genes called epigenetics. It's a very, very complex process, but it's a way of switching genes on or switching genes off and regulating their expression. And we see that this low protein diet actually resulting in significantly fewer of these tags, these epigenetic tags on the DNA from the sperm. We think that this could be changing gene expression patterns within very early embryo to change the way that the embryo develops and ultimately change the long-term health of their offspring. Now, there are many other diets out there. There's a lot of good work, again, in Australia. Australia is an absolutely fabulous base for this type of research, looking at the impact of the father's diet at the moment. There's many, many good researchers there, looking at things like high-fat diet. So obviously, not many people in the Western world are probably having too little of many of their nutrients, are having too much. So one of the influences is, does something like a high-fat diet, a Western diet, does that also influence the sperm and the long-term offspring health in a similar manner? And the answer seems to be, yes, it does. Again, the offspring seem to be more prone to having cardiovascular disease and obesity. And again, this information carried within the sperm also seems to be altered similarly in response to high-fat diets. But we can also do things like looking at high protein, low protein, high calorie, low calorie, high sugar, high salt. And again, this is one of the real benefits of these kind of animal models. In the first instance, we can work out what might be the real key nutritional influences passed on by parents, or that can influence the quality of their sperm and their eggs and their embryos. And we can then start to kind of tunnel down into the mechanisms. And we can also hopefully start to then do interventions. So if we know that from a maternal diet that women should have things like folic acid during pregnancy, because it's very, very important for neural tube defects and preventing those. But the folic acid also provides these marks that go on our DNA and on the way our DNA is packaged in our sperm and in every cell of our body that influence whether genes are switched on or switched off. And what we would like to do with our males on our low-protein diet is give them things like folic acid and various other B vitamins to see if that can change this information that's passed on by the sperm and hopefully prevent the long-term ill health of their offspring. So can we give men supplements? Can we give male animals supplements similar to women who have during pregnancy or early pregnancy that can also be very, very beneficial for their offspring's health?
I'm looking forward to hearing that. We'll have to have you back again when you finish that research. I'm glad you're keeping going on this topic. But just for people who, I guess, for genetics and epigenetics, they may all be, a bit foreign terms. I guess, our genes are, I guess, set in stone. Once we have conceived that, our genes are set there. But epigenetics are the changes that are made in the environment. Can you just explain a little bit about epigenetics versus our genetics?
Sure thing. So epigenetics, epi means above, and genetics obviously means our genes. So this is a way of switching genes on or off that doesn't involve mutating the DNA. So a way that I explain this to a lot of people is if we think again about every cell in our body has exactly the same genetic information as every other cell in our body. We all started from a single fertilized egg, and that egg simply split and split and split and split. So the DNA within our hair cells, within our eye cells, within our muscles, heart, liver, kidneys, sperm, or in our eggs, is the same genetic information as in every other cell, but all our cells are very, very different. So the cells need a way of switching. If it's a kidney cell, it needs a way to express those kidney genes, but switch off genes that might turn it into a bone cell because it doesn't need those bone cells. But it doesn't want to lose or mutate that DNA because that would predispose it to conditions like cancer. So it just switches those genes off. It switches off the genes that it doesn't want, and it switches on the genes that it does want. And it can do this for various different modifications. It can change how open the DNA is to being expressed and how tightly the DNA is packaged and wrapped up. And these are all very fluid, very plastic mechanisms that can change from hour to hour. And we know that in the very early embryo, there's a lot of epigenetic changes taking place. The very first few days of life are very important for taking the sperm and the embryo and the patterns that came from the sperm and the egg, and then changing them and cleaning them away and then establishing a new embryonic pattern of epigenetic that will then tell the embryo, you are no longer a sperm or an egg, you are now an embryo and you need to develop into a brand new fetus and hopefully a healthy adult. And so the information that's kind of carried via our sperm and our eggs and the way that this information is remodeled in the very early embryo are critical for establishing our patterns of genes that are going to be expressed throughout our entire lifetime. And there's a huge body of work of trying to understand what the impact of the father's diet or the mother's diet and lifestyle are on this epigenetic information in the sperm and the eggs, how that's influencing the epigenetic information and gene expression in the early embryo, and ultimately how that influences our gene expression as an adult. And it seems there's a lot of sensitivity during these early stages of pregnancy, and that could really influence our long-term health.
Yeah, obviously the diet and the environment they're growing in has a huge impact. And I know I did another webinar with Professor Louise Hull, who works with Sarah actually, and she's looking into the role of sugar. And her research was focusing on sugar and its effect on, the egg and the sperm. And I know they're actually doing another study in Melbourne now. I think Gemma Evans is heading that one. They're looking at the real world implications, I guess, of this research model sort of study on sugar in real life human beings, and working out what that has implications for the embryo. So it's an exciting time to be in the field of genetics and reproductive health, I think. So I'm glad to hear that your research is continuing. That's for sure, which is very exciting. So I guess when we look at, you know, females, and we have all the eggs that we're ever going to have, and, you know, to some extent we're, you know, damaging them every day as soon as we're born, really. You know, they start to degrade, and when we get less and less eggs, and the quality obviously degrades as we get older, which is why a lot of older women do have trouble conceiving. But I guess in relation to sperm, that's not really the case. You know, they manufacture them all the time. So is there I guess a window where the diet is more important? Is it throughout the life, or is there a window when that sperm is developing that is more important?
Well, this is one of those interesting things. So the perception is that, yes, men's sperm quality does not change with age. Men can produce sperm well into, or almost up to the day that we die, and that is very true. But the stem cells within our testes that produce those sperm are there from birth, and they keep dividing and dividing and dividing through our life. So whilst the sperm are produced consistently, those stem cells that produce those sperm are there from birth and keep dividing. And again, another analogy I kind of use quite often is if you try and photocopy the same sheet over and over and over and over and over again, after a while, the copies that you start to get out may not be as good quality as the ones you started with the first time. So we think this is happening also in men. It doesn't happen. So with women, obviously, the eggs are there, they're shut down, they're quiescent from birth, and they start to mature one by one. While it's still more an active process in men, those stem cells are still very, very sensitive and exposed to a lifetime of smoking, poor air quality, obesity. So again, as we have 20, 30, 40 years of that poor lifestyle, the sperm that we start to make actually can be decreased in their quality. We do know that male fertility drops slightly as we get older. That's because our hormone levels start to change. And so sperm quantity and quality do tail off. But we also know that a lifetime, or even, you know, a couple of years worth of poor health quality can start to impact very much on sperm quality. Now, with a lot of things, men can change that very, very easily by improving their lifestyle. So if you are overweight, one of the best things to do is to drop a bit of weight. That will improve your fertility immensely and your sperm quality. If you're smoking, stop that, because that's going to impact very badly on your reproductive health. We know that smoking leads to erectile dysfunction as well as impacting on the quality of the sperm. So there are many, many lifestyle factors that can improve a man's fertility. We're also starting to get some idea that male age and man's age can, again, influence the long-term health of his offspring. So we quite often see in the media that things like old rock stars or movie stars that are having their 5th child, and you kind of, this backs up this idea that men's fertility is kind of unlimited and will go on forever. But typically what you'll also see is that rock star or that film star is with a much younger woman. And what we know is that the embryo can tolerate, or the egg, sorry, can tolerate a certain amount of poor quality sperm. It can rectify it, it can repair it. But once the egg starts to get a bit older and the poor quality sperm starts to get a bit older, then that repair process starts to break down. And so if you pair an old sperm with an old embryo with an old egg, then that has a lot of reproductive implications. And for most couples, if the man's a bit older, then his partner will likely be a bit older. And that's where you also start to see a lot of the fertility issues. So although men don't have the same fertility decline, or to the same extent as women do, it is still there, and having a lifetime of, or a poor quality lifetime and lifestyle factors will inevitably impact on sperm quality.
So obviously more similar to that extent than we previously thought. So you are impacting your sperm health throughout your life, obviously, because of those stem cells. there is, I mean, in women, obviously we are as well, you know, we're depleting the eggs, we're depleting the egg quality, but there's still that window where we can have, you know, an impact while that egg is developing. I guess, would you say for men out there who are thinking now, oh no, what have I done? You know, my uni years have really blown my sperm out of the water. So how not that we can reverse that, but is there hope that we can, you know, influence that health and positively improve the sperm health in that window prior to conception?
Absolutely. I mean, obviously, we can't go back in time. So if we are a bit of an older man, then obviously there's nothing you can necessarily do about that. But you can certainly improve your lifestyle. Lifestyle is a really big factor. So as I said before, if you're overweight, obesity is one of the biggest detrimental things for fertility, both in men and women. It really does hit male fertility very hard. So if you're overweight, dropping a bit of weight, and it's not a kind of a all or nothing, it's very much a sliding scale. So as you start to lose weight, your fertility will start to increase incrementally. So the more weight you can lose, the better. Obviously, again, as in women as well, being massively underweight is very, very detrimental to our fertility. So it's not just about being overweight, it's about being of an optimal, of an ideal weight. Typically going hand in hand with that, you've got things like type 2 diabetes, which we know of is very bad for sperm quality. So as we improve our BMI, improve our weight, our blood sugar levels will improve as well. Smoking is very bad for many aspects of our fertility. Too much alcohol, recreational drugs, all of those kind of things can influence sperm quality. And there's even studies that have come out this year looking at our underwear. So men who wear very tight underwear, studies have shown that that may influence sperm quality. It warms up the testes, and as we all know, the testes hang on the outside of the body because they like to be a couple of degrees cooler than the inside of our body. And that seems to be optimal for sperm production. So things like our underwear, if you've got very, very tight underwear, that could impact on your fertility and reduce your sperm count.
So the boxes versus jocks myth is true. It's, you know, the boxes are better for fertility, obviously, with what the research is showing. Is that
it does seem to be going that way. It does seem to be, yeah, kind of, you know, if you want to be a father, you know, let them hang free.
Yep. There you go. Well, that's always been a debate. So there we go. We've answered that debate today. You've heard it here. That's the facts. So I guess.
So yes, there are many things that men can do to improve their fertility. And again, like with women, a real key message that a lot of us, and your website is doing really great things for this, is trying to say is, if you're wanting to become parents, think about your lifestyle, your weight, those kind of factors before, ideally a couple of months before you want to become parents. In men, it takes about 90 days for a sperm to go from one of those stem cells to a fully mature sperm that can be used to fertilize an egg. So that's 3 months of a window where your lifestyle can influence possibly that sperm that is ultimately going to fertilize the egg. So ideally, you want to 6 months to 3 months before you're thinking about becoming parents, look at your lifestyle, think, are we not eating a healthy, balanced diet? Are we consuming too much alcohol? Are we smoking? Are we not necessarily getting enough exercise? Is our BMI a bit too high? Would it be good for that to come down? So that preconception period, 3 to 6 months, is very, very important for making sure that your reproductive health is as good as it could be. And then that should hopefully mean good quality sperm, good quality eggs, good quality embryos.
So obviously, again, it's more similar than we first thought, because women obviously are very similar. We have a development of the egg, and it's those 90 days. And I work with patients in my Fertility for You program over those 90 days for that reason, because of that egg development. But obviously, the sperm are following a similar development cycle. So, you know, if men are thinking, yeah, I've done my dash, I've had too much alcohol in my uni years, obviously you can obviously not reverse it, but we can improve the preconception health in those 90 days. And I think that's a really important thing for men to become aware of, because it is focused on the female. I see a lot of female patients come and I want to fall pregnant, or I'm struggling to fall pregnant and want to focus on their preconception health. But as long as the male has a tick and everything's in the normal range, they're kind of, well, I'm fine. So obviously there's more to it than that.
Absolutely. And the wonderful thing about the preconception period is it's a time in certainly many couples' life where they will sit down and go, okay, we're trying for a baby. We want this baby to be healthy as it can be. And so we will actually really consider our lifestyle. Many women will take, again, the folic acid, the supplements. Many women will consider their health in and around that conception period. But what we are trying to do, and many other researchers like me are trying to say, guys, come on, we also need to think about our health during that window. It may not be very helpful if a woman is trying to have a very healthy lifestyle to maximize her fertility, fitness, and the health of the embryo. And if that's being completely undone, if the guy simply thinks, well, all I'm doing is passing on my genes, so it doesn't matter if I'm out every night, having several beers, having kebabs, smoking, all of these kind of things. So what we really feel is, and what is really lacking in public information, is if a woman goes to a clinic to talk to a health professional about her fertility and about her fertility fitness, almost no information is ever given to the father or the prospective father. There is very little information given to men about men's reproductive health and what we can do. And as you say, it's essentially the same kind of information that is given to many, many women. So we think that information should be available for men. Men should understand their own reproductive health. I appreciate men. A lot of men don't like to talk about their health, particularly things reproductive-wise. We like to clam up about those kind of things. But even just being aware of our influence on the health of our offspring, I think if men knew more about that, they would be much more inclined to kind of look at their own lifestyle and their own fitness.
I agree, and that's a key message we're hoping to get across tonight, whether there's females listening or there are some males out there, or the females are going to go back to their partners and tell them to listen. But I think that's the key message, because as you said, males, they're probably not that open to talking about their health, not that probably interested in changing the diet and lifestyle. But if they knew the implications for the lifelong health of their child, not only, about falling pregnant, obviously sperm health has a huge impact on the ability to fall pregnant, but, well beyond that. So I think that's a key message that will hopefully spark their enthusiasm for a lifestyle and health change.
Absolutely. And they're fairly straightforward interventions that you can do. And again, if you're doing this as a couple, you've got that natural support base of each other. So if you're thinking, right, let's both of us for the next 6 to 3 months look at our lifestyle, trim back on things, maybe reduce the amount of saturated fat that we're getting, maybe do a bit more exercise, reduce the amount of alcohol. If you're doing that as a couple, that's a lot easier than one person trying to do it on their own, and it will double the benefits for your reproductive fitness.
Yeah, so not only get you a healthy baby, but healthy outcome for your baby as well. And I know I do work with a lot of couples, so I work with some single, women, but also a lot of couples, which is really great over that 90-day period. So I'll be sure to reinforce with the males who are doing it beside their partners what an impact they are having by doing this program over the 90 days, that they are really having an impact on the long-term health of their child. Now, I know you're doing some more research as well coming up, because we were briefly talking off air. So can you share some of the research that you have in the pipeline? I'd love to get you to talk about that again sometime.
Sure thing. Absolutely. Be very happy to. So we're just starting a body of research where we're expanding with our mouse models again. So we're looking at not just the low protein diet, the suboptimal diet, but we're also going for a Western diet, because as we were saying, this is possibly more applicable to many people, particularly in Western societies, certainly in Europe, America, Australia, New Zealand, that we're actually having a much more kind of affluent diet. So do things like having a high fat, a high Western diet, do these also influence and change the sperm and impact on the health of their offspring as much as, say, a low protein diet? And we're also wanting to look at, again, I was talking earlier about things like folic acid that we know are very important in women for preventing things like neural tube defects, but they're also very important for regulating these epigenetic mechanisms that influence gene expression. So what we also want to do is, can we improve the diet by giving our male mice a supplement that contains things like these B vitamins, folate, that we normally get from our diet and from things like green leafy vegetables that, frankly, probably most of us don't eat enough of. And if we give our males these supplements, these vitamins and minerals, can that prevent these long-term ill health consequences for their offspring? So we know that women during pregnancy quite often will get a vitamin supplement or take folic acid supplements. Should we be giving men of poor health quality these same kind of supplements in the run-up to becoming a father as well? And we want to look at the impact of those kind of things. And we really want to continue to tunnel into these mechanisms of how does a father influence the growth and health of his offspring. Because if we know that, then hopefully we can intervene in other ways as well to prevent these changes during these very early stages of development that will ultimately, hopefully, benefit the long-term health of their offspring.
Well, congratulations on all your research. It's really fascinating. I found our discussion fascinating, and thanks again for joining us at reasonably late notice. I just had to reach out and get you to talk to us because I think it is such an important topic, and you really are providing insights above and beyond what we have known about the role of sperm. So thank you so much for joining us, and congratulations on all you've achieved. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about your research.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's really nice to be able to come up here, and I know a lot of women get very, not quite upset, but feel that there's a lot of negative information given to them. There's a lot of bashing given to women that if their child is of poor health, it's something that they have done. It's their fault during pregnancy. And it's nice to be able to come up and say, guys, actually, we are half of the equation on this. We need to think about our health. It's not just down to the woman's health. It's not just the woman's responsibility, as with so many things in reproductive health. We have a duty as well to look at our lifestyle, influence our health, and hopefully influence the health of our children.
You're right, because that is something I think women take on, even if they're struggling to fall pregnant. They do assume it's their fault. So it's interesting to see that obviously it takes two to tango. We do say that, Absolutely. But we don't focus on the male partner. So I hope we have busted some of those myths today and really shown the importance that men can have. So
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for joining us. And if you do want some more information on some of the other podcasts and webinars that we mentioned today, you can jump on my website at tashajennings.com.au, and they also at conceivebaby.com.au. And I know we talked a lot about diet and lifestyle today, and I do have a free checklist you can get. Your Fertile Pantry checklist, which does go through some of the key changes that I recommend people make for preconception health. So you can find that at tashajennings.com.au/checklist. So thanks everyone for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you next time.